unmistakable style on American pickers, collapsed. Her hand
Danielle Colby had been living what many would call a quiet life lately. Away from the flashing cameras, drama-filled headlines, and the fast-paced life of reality TV, she seemed to have found her peace. Her social media posts had turned softer, more thoughtful. There were pictures of vintage art, calm moments with her pets, and even reflections on the past. No hints of chaos, no sign of the storm that was about to come. Fans who followed her thought she was doing okay. Maybe even healing, maybe moving forward. But sometimes life hides its hardest hits in silence, and sometimes people carry pain so quietly that even their closest fans never see it coming. On the day of the court ruling, Danielle showed up with a steady expression, not too emotional, not too distant either. She walked into the courtroom dressed simply, but with her usual unique style. Some noticed the sadness in her eyes. Others thought she looked tired but strong. No one expected what would happen next. No one was ready. Not even Danielle. The courtroom was filled with reporters, lawyers, and a few close people from Fritz's circle. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but that didn't stop the buzz. Everyone knew this was going to be an emotional day, but no one had a clue how deep the impact would be. Especially on Danielle. To understand why this moment was so heavy, you need to understand the bond she had with Frank. They weren't just TV co-stars, they were a team. From the very beginning of American Pickers, Danielle was the heart behind the scenes, while Frank and Mike were on the road. But her relationship with Frank wasn't just professional. Over the years they became like family. They shared laughs, business moments, private jokes, and sometimes even disagreements. But that's what real friendships are like. Real, raw, and deeply rooted. So when things started going wrong in Frank's life, when health issues and personal struggles took over, Danielle never really spoke out in public. But those close to her say she was hurting. She missed the old days. She missed the team, and deep down maybe she felt helpless too. Watching someone you care about go through a dark time, especially when you're not in control, is one of the hardest feelings in the world. In the months leading up to the verdict, Danielle had remained quiet. No public interviews, no dramatic statements, just silence. Maybe it was her way of coping. Maybe she didn't want to add more noise to an already painful story. Or maybe deep down she was still holding on to hope. But all of that changed in that courtroom. The judge began to speak. The room grew still. The words were clear, but heavy. They confirmed what many feared. Frank was gone, and not just gone in the physical sense, but gone in a way that left behind questions, regrets, and unfinished conversations. Danielle's face changed the moment those words hit the air. At first she just blinked. Then slowly her lips began to tremble. Her hands, once calm, began to shake slightly, and then she lowered her head. Some people in the courtroom turned away. Others watched frozen in their seats, but no one said a word. It was like time had stopped. What people saw next would be talked about for days. Danielle, who had always been known for her boldness, for her spark, for her ability to stay strong even in chaos, broke down. It wasn't dramatic or loud, it was quiet but so deep. A kind of heartbreak that doesn't need words. Her shoulders began to shake. She covered her face, and for a few minutes the woman who had been a symbol of strength and independence looked completely shattered. It was real. And it was raw. Some say a court officer came over to check on her. Others say she whispered something to herself, something that no one could hear clearly. Maybe it was Frank's name. Maybe it was a prayer. Maybe it was just pain, finding its way out after being buried for too long. People often forget that celebrities are human too. That behind the spotlight there are real emotions, real friendships, real grief. What happened to Danielle in that courtroom wasn't about fame. It wasn't about the show. It was about loss. Deep personal loss. She didn't try to fix her makeup afterward. She didn't try to pretend she was okay. She just sat there quietly wiping her tears, trying to pull herself together. But you could tell. This moment would stay with her forever. And for those who watched from the sidelines, it became clear, this wasn't just a sad story about a celebrity death. It was a human story. A story about friendship, about silence, about strength breaking down in the most unexpected places. Danielle had walked into that courtroom as someone who had survived a lot. But on that day she wasn't trying to be strong. She was just a friend who lost someone who meant more than the world knew. And that moment, that emotional silence, said more than any headline ever could. The courtroom was quiet, too quiet. There were people sitting in every row, but no one was talking. Phones were turned off, pens weren't moving, and even the sound of breathing seemed soft. Something about that day felt different. Everyone could feel it. Maybe it was the weight of the case. Maybe it was the person it was about. Or maybe it was just the silence before something big happened. Danielle Colby sat a few rows back. Her eyes were focused, but her thoughts were far away. She looked like someone who had been trying to stay strong for a long time. Her hands were folded on her lap. She wasn't fidgeting or moving, but if you look closely you could see it. The tension in her jaw, the way she blinked more than usual, the stillness that wasn't natural for someone like her. Danielle was known for her energy, her fire, her presence. But today she seemed small, quiet, waiting. At the front the judge was getting ready to speak. Papers shuffled, a file was opened, the courtroom officer gave a small nod. That was the moment. The one before everything changes. Everyone leaned in a little, not with their bodies, but with their minds. They were holding their breath. The judge started to read. His voice was calm, steady, and firm. He used simple words, but the meaning behind those words was anything but simple. He spoke about the investigation, the timeline, and finally the outcome. The room was still. The verdict was about Frank Fritz. A name that once made people smile, now filled the room with pain. What the judge said next changed everything. The verdict confirmed something many didn't want to believe. Frank's situation had been worse than most knew. There were signs that something had gone very wrong behind the scenes. The judge didn't share all the details, but what he did share was enough. Enough to shock the courtroom, enough to make people ask questions, enough to make Danielle close her eyes for a few seconds, as if trying to block out the words. Some people whispered. Some gasped. One woman even put her hand over her mouth. It wasn't just a legal decision. It was a truth being spoken out loud for the first time. One that couldn't be taken back. Danielle sat very still. She didn't cry. Not yet. But her eyes were glassy. Her breathing changed. The courtroom, which had already felt heavy, now felt like a place where the air had been sucked out. Everyone was thinking the same thing. How did it come to this? Frank Fritz had once been one of the most loved TV personalities in the world of antique picking. He had charm, a big smile, and a love for finding hidden treasures. He made people laugh. He made people feel something. He wasn't just a part of a show, he was part of people's lives. And to see his story end like this, in a courtroom with sad faces and a painful verdict, was something no one expected. But this wasn't just about Frank. This was also about those who were left behind. People like Danielle, people who had known him, worked with him, laughed with him, and now had to sit in silence as a judge read out the final chapter of a shared story. What made this moment even harder was the mystery. The judge gave facts, but not full answers. There were hints. There were questions left hanging in the air. Had someone failed Frank? Had something been missed? Was there something more behind the scenes? The courtroom couldn't ask out loud, but the questions were clear in every face. Danielle quote, Seth's face told a story too. A story of someone who wasn't just hearing legal words, she was hearing memories. She was hearing the sound of past laughter, the feel of old road trips, the weight of unsaid things. Maybe she was thinking about the last time she spoke to Frank. Maybe she wished she had said more. Maybe she had. Nobody knew exactly what Danielle was thinking in that moment, but it was clear she was hurting, not in the loud, dramatic way, but in the quiet, deep way that only happens when someone you cared about is gone, and nothing you do can bring them back. And then just like that, the judge finished. The words were done. The verdict had been spoken, but the room didn't move. Not at first. People just sat there, still shocked, unsure of what to do next. Danielle didn't move either. She was still staring ahead, her hands still folded, her eyes wide and wet. It was the kind of moment that changes people. That stays with you. You could tell that everyone in that room would remember it. Not just because of what was said, but because of how it felt. Outside the courtroom, reporters were waiting. Cameras were ready, headlines were being written even before people walked out the door. But inside it wasn't about news. It was about grief. About how one life and one verdict could leave so many people feeling broken. Danielle finally stood up. Slowly, carefully, like someone who was carrying something heavy inside. She didn't speak. She didn't look around. She just walked out. But with each step she left behind a silence that said more than any words ever could. The verdict was out, the truth, or at least a part of it, had been spoken, and now everyone who loved Frank, especially Danielle, had to figure out how to live with it. What happens next? That's the question no one could answer. Not yet. The room was full of people, but at that moment, Danielle Colby felt completely alone. It was strange how quickly everything had changed. One moment she was sitting, waiting, holding herself together, and the next her whole world felt like it had fallen apart. It didn't happen with a loud scream. It didn't happen with some big scene. It happened quietly, softly. But it was real, and it was powerful. When the judge read the final words, something inside Danielle cracked. She didn't stand up. She didn't say anything, but her body spoke for her. Her shoulders dropped. Her eyes filled with tears. Her lips started to shake like she was trying not to let out a sound. It was the kind of pain that doesn't need noise. The kind that sits deep in your chest and doesn't go away quickly. People around her noticed. A few turned their heads, unsure of what to do. No one reached out, not because they didn't care, but because the moment felt too fragile. It was like a bubble that could burst if anyone tried to touch it. So they just watched, quietly, respectfully, as Danielle slowly began to fall apart from the inside. She leaned forward slightly, covering part of her face with her hand. Her other hand pressed against her chest. Her eyes, red now, blinked fast, trying to stop the tears from falling. But it didn't work. The tears came anyway. Not loud, not wild, just slow, sad, steady, like her heart was speaking through them. It wasn't just grief. It was regret. It was confusion. It was shock. So many feelings were rushing through her at once that it became impossible to tell which one was strongest. Maybe it wasn't just about what the judge said. Maybe it was about all the memories that came back in a flash. The old road trips with Frank, the inside jokes, the way he used to laugh at something silly she said. The moments when they argued but still found a way to move forward. The quiet times they didn't even need to talk. It all came back at once, like a wave crashing into her. Too strong to stop, too real to ignore. She had been strong for so long. Through the ups and downs of the show, through Frank's health problems, through the rumors, the media, the silence, but now sitting there, everything she had tried to hold in came out, and she couldn't hide it anymore. Somewhere deep inside, maybe she had hoped for a different outcome. Maybe part of her still believed that somehow things could be fixed, that there was still time. But now that the verdict was out, now that the truth was clear, she had to face it. Frank wasn't coming back, and nothing she could say or do would change that. That truth hit her harder than she expected. It quotes not easy to watch someone you care about fall apart. And for the people sitting nearby, it was a painful sight. Danielle, the strong woman they had watched for years, the one who always had something clever to say, the one who always kept things moving, now sat quietly, her world breaking apart in front of them. A few people said later that it looked like time had stopped, that Danielle wasn't really in the room anymore. She was somewhere else, somewhere in her memories, somewhere in the past, somewhere with Frank. After a few minutes she finally moved. Just a small movement. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She took a slow breath, like she was trying to pull herself together again. But you could tell it wasn't easy. You could tell it wasn't over. A part of her would probably never be the same. Everyone talks about loss, but few talk about the moment it truly hits you. That second when your heart finally understands what your mind has been trying to accept. That second when you realize someone is gone forever, and all the time you thought you had with them is now just memory. That's what happened to Danielle in that courtroom. It wasn't just news. It was a goodbye she never wanted to say. People outside the room would later read about it in headlines. Some would talk about her reaction, maybe even judge it. But they wouldn't really know. They wouldn't know what it's like to lose a friend like that. A friend who had been through so much with you. A friend who had shared the best and worst days of your life. A friend you didn't always agree with, but always cared for. As Danielle finally stood up to leave, her steps were slow. She didn't look around. She didn't try to fix her makeup. She didn't try to look strong, because she wasn't strong in that moment. She was just human. A person who had loved, who had lost, and who now had to carry that pain forward. But even in her silence there was strength. Not the kind that stands tall, but the kind that survives. The kind that keeps walking, even when everything inside you wants to fall down. The kind that says, I'm still here, even when your heart is broken. And that in its own way made her stronger than ever. The door of the courtroom opened, and Danielle Colby stepped out into the world that suddenly felt very different. Reporters were waiting, cameras were pointed, but she didn't stop. She didn't look at anyone. Her eyes were low, her steps quiet. Even with all the noise outside, something about her presence made people go silent. There was a sadness around her that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't just grief, it was something deeper. Like she had just lost a piece of herself that she would never get back. People tried to read her face. They wanted a reaction, a quote, a moment they could turn into headlines. But Danielle wasn't giving anything. Not today, the world had already taken enough from her. She got into the car that was waiting and sat in silence. The driver didn't speak. He could tell she needed time. Danielle looked out the window, watching the buildings pass, but her mind was somewhere else. Somewhere far away. She wasn't thinking about cameras or news, or even the court. She was thinking about Frank. About how fast life had changed. About all the things she didn't say to him. About how she wished she could turn back time just to have one more conversation. One more laugh. One more moment. There quotes something strange about grief. It doesn't always come like a storm. Sometimes it arrives like a whisper. A slow, quiet pain that settles into your chest and refuses to leave. That's what Danielle was feeling now. A heavy silence inside her heart that made everything else feel distant. Even the sunlight outside the window felt colder. When she reached home, she didn't speak to anyone. She just went to her room and sat down. There were photos on the wall. Old pictures of her and the team. Her Mike and Frank smiling in some forgotten town, holding dusty treasures they had found on the road. Those moments felt like a lifetime ago now. She stared at one picture in particular. Frank was laughing in it, his face full of joy. It wasn't for the camera. It was real. That made it hurt more. It reminded her of who he really was. Not the version people saw on TV, not the headlines. But the real Frank, the one she knew. The one who made dumb jokes just to make her roll her eyes. The one who cared more than he let people see. The one who was gone now. She picked up her phone and opened their old messages. Most of them were simple. Inside jokes, photos of antiques, updates about life. Some were unread. She had never replied to them. Maybe she had been too busy. Maybe she had planned to text back later. But now those unread messages felt like little pieces of regret. Little moments that would never come back. Danielle put the phone down and let out a slow breath. She didn't cry again. Not this time. She had cried enough in court. Now she just felt tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. A deeper kind. The kind that wraps around your bones and makes everything feel heavier. She knew people would expect her to speak soon. To say something about the verdict. About Frank. About how she was feeling. But she wasn't ready. How do you find words for something that doesn't make sense? How do you explain the feeling of losing someone who was part of your story from the beginning? She looked around her room. It was quiet. Too quiet. That's when it hit her. Silence was the loudest thing now. No texts from Frank. No calls. No more messages asking about the next big find. Just silence. It felt like it was shouting. She stood up and walked over to a shelf where she kept some old souvenirs from their travels. There was a small metal sign they had found together at a flea market years ago. It was rusted and broken. But Frank had insisted it was full of character. She had laughed at him then. Now she picked it up gently and held it like it was something precious. Because it was. Memories began to flood her mind again. Long road trips, early mornings, coffee stops, arguments over what was worth buying. Moments when they didn't need to talk at all, because they just understood each other. Danielle had been more than just the woman behind the phone calls on the show. She had been part of the heartbeat of it all. And Frank had been her friend through every up and down. Now, that chapter was closed. Not with a goodbye, but with a verdict. A cold final statement in a courtroom that didn't know their full story. Still holding the sign, she sat down and stared at it for a long time. Her mind started writing the words she couldn't say out loud. Things she wished she could tell Frank. Things like, I'm sorry. I miss you. I wish I had done more. I wish we had more time. She knew grief wasn't something you got over. It was something you learned to carry. And now she would carry this with her. Every day. In every quiet moment. In every memory that caught her by surprise. Outside, the world moved on. People talked. Stories spread, but inside her little room time stood still. Because when you lose someone who helped build your life, the world doesn't feel the same anymore. And as Danielle sat there with an old rusted sign in her hands and a storm in her heart, one question played in her mind over and over again. The days after the court had passed its verdict were the hardest for Danielle. It wasn't just about the loss of Frank, it was about everything that had changed in such a short time. Every part of her life felt different now, like the ground she stood on had shifted without warning. There were moments when she woke up and forgot for a split second. She would reach for her phone ready to text Frank something silly about the day, but then the truth would come back, heavy and painful. There was no more texting him, no more phone calls, no more simple messages that reminded her they were both still part of this strange world of picking and laughter. The mornings were the hardest. She would sit in silence, staring out the window, wondering if this was how life was going to be from now on. Quiet, lonely, without the laughter that Frank had always brought to her world. People expected her to get on with it, to carry on as she always had, but how could she? How could anyone just move on when someone so important had been taken away? She had always been the strong one. On the show, in life, even in moments of personal pain, Danielle kept moving forward. She was the one who smiled even when things weren't perfect, the one who made others laugh when they didn't feel like it. But now, for the first time in a long time, she didn't have the strength to keep going as if everything was fine. How could she pretend when she knew her heart was broken? It wasn't just the loss of a friend, it was the loss of a part of herself. Frank had been there for her during the toughest times. They had supported each other in ways most people didn't understand. In the world of TV and fame, where everything felt like a performance, Frank had always been real. And for that, Danielle had trusted him. They had shared more than just moments on the road. They had shared pieces of their hearts. Her mind kept drifting back to the last time they had been together. She remembered the way he looked when they said goodbye. It was a quick hug, just like any other. But now that simple hug felt like the final goodbye. It wasn't a dramatic farewell. It wasn't some big moment. It was just them, like they always had been, sharing one last moment before everything fell apart. But even though Frank was gone, his memory was still with her. It was in the little things. The way she would laugh at something that reminded her of an old joke they had. The way she could hear his voice in her mind when something went wrong, and she knew what he would have said. Those memories were the only thing keeping her going. But they were also the hardest things to hold on to because they reminded her of what she had lost. Danielle didn't know how to move on. She didn't know how to face the world again. But there was one thing she knew for sure. She couldn't let the memory of Frank fade away. He deserved more than that. He deserved to be remembered for the person he truly was, not the headlines or the way the world tried to define him. And if she couldn't speak to him anymore, the least she could do was honor his memory in the best way she knew how. It wasn't easy. It wasn't something that could happen overnight, but she decided that she would start with the people who still mattered. She would reach out to the people who had always been there for her, the ones who hadn't expected her to be perfect. The ones who understood that she was hurting, just like they were. Her phone sat on the table in front of her. For a moment she thought about calling Mike. He was the one person who knew her well enough to understand the weight of this loss. He would know how to make her smile, even if just for a moment. But she didn't call him. Instead she typed a message to him, short and simple, "I miss him, Mike." It was the truth. She missed Frank more than she could put into words. But for the first time in days, writing that message felt like a small step forward. She wasn't ready to be strong yet. She wasn't ready to take on the world or pretend like everything was okay. But she could take small steps. She could honor the memory of Frank by remembering the good times and keeping those memories close, even if they hurt. Later that day, she found herself standing in front of her closet. She stared at the clothes that she had worn for so many years. She thought about how she had always hidden behind those clothes, behind the costumes, behind the act. But now, in the quiet of her room, Danielle realized she didn't need to hide anymore. She didn't need to be the strong one all the time. She just needed to be herself. There were days ahead that would be harder than others. Days when the weight of the loss would feel like too much to carry. But there were also days when she would smile again, remembering the good times with Frank. And those moments, however small, would be enough to keep her going. Danielle knew that life had changed, maybe forever. But she also knew she didn't have to face it alone. There were people who loved her, who understood her pain, and there were people who would always remember Frank for the way he made the world a little bit brighter. Even in the darkest moments, the memory of Frank's laughter would never fade. And as long as she held on to that, she could find the strength to keep moving forward, one step at a time. It had been weeks since the court's verdict, but Danielle still couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The weight of Frank's absence didn't just stay with her in the quiet moments, it followed her everywhere. It was there when she went to the store, when she sat down to watch TV, when she tried to enjoy her favorite hobbies. Everywhere she went, it felt like a hole had opened up, and no matter what she did, nothing could fill it. She was used to being strong, used to keeping everything together, but now even the smallest things seemed harder than before. Her friends had reached out, sending messages and checking in. Some of them tried to make her smile, talking about random things, or sending pictures to brighten her day. But Danielle felt disconnected. They didn't understand, how could they? No one knew what it was like to lose someone you had shared so much of your life with, someone who had been there when you needed them the most. Some days it felt like she was just going through the motions. She would wake up, make her coffee, and start her day as if everything was fine. But inside it felt different. She couldn't stop thinking about Frank, about how in the moments when she needed to talk to him the most, he wouldn't be there. She had no one to turn to, no one who could understand her pain like he could. It was a strange kind of loneliness. She was surrounded by people, yet felt completely alone. She couldn't even find comfort in the things that once brought her joy. Her favorite TV shows didn't make her laugh anymore. The books she used to read no longer held her attention. Even the road trips she had loved with Frank and the team now felt empty. Every corner of her life seemed to be filled with memories of him, and not in a comforting way. The memories were too raw, too painful. She found herself reaching for the phone again, but every time she hesitated. She had to remind herself that Frank wasn't on the other end anymore. She would type a message, stop and delete it. The words never seemed right. What was there left to say? There was no point in telling him anything anymore. It felt like she was talking to the air. There was a moment though when she could no longer ignore the truth. She had to stop running from it. She had to face the fact that Frank was gone, that things had changed in a way she couldn't undo. But how could she do that? How could she accept a world without him? One afternoon, while sorting through some old boxes in her closet, she came across an old notebook. It was one of the notebooks she had used to jot down ideas and thoughts during their travels. It wasn't just a notebook, it was a piece of their story. A story that she realized now was more important than anything else in her life. She opened the first page, and immediately memories came flooding back. She remembered the night they had driven through a storm, laughing because they were lost, and didn't know where they were going. She remembered the way Frank would scribble notes in the margins, making jokes about the things they had found during the day. Those notes weren't just about the antiques they had picked up. They were about their journey together, their friendship, their adventures, and their shared moments. As she flipped through the pages, Danielle found a message Frank had written. It was from a trip they had taken a few years ago. He had written it during a late-night stop at a diner. It said, "The world might not always make sense, but the people we meet along the way, they do." Danielle closed the notebook for a moment and let the words sink in. In that simple note, Frank had captured everything she had been feeling but couldn't put into words. The world didn't make sense anymore. But Frank had made sense. His friendship had made sense, their connection had been real, and it was that realness that she missed the most. That was the moment it hit her. She couldn't keep hiding from the pain. She couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. She had to face the loss, but facing it didn't mean forgetting it. It didn't mean pretending like Frank hadn't mattered. It meant remembering him for who he was, for the person he had been, for the way he had shaped her life in ways no one else ever would. Danielle took the notebook and placed it on her desk, deciding that she would start writing again. Not just about her adventures or the places she had been, but about what Frank had meant to her. She would write about their time together, about the way he had made her laugh even when things were tough, about the bond they shared that had been deeper than anything the world could see. She wouldn't let the world forget him. And she wouldn't forget him either. Over the next few weeks, Danielle slowly started to find her way back. It wasn't easy. There were still days when the sadness was overwhelming, when she couldn't stop thinking about the past, but there were also days when she felt a little lighter, a little less lost. Slowly she began to accept that things would never be the same. But she didn't have to keep fighting the change. She could embrace it, even if it hurt. She could honor Frank's memory by living a life that reflected what he had taught her, to embrace the journey, no matter how uncertain it might be. She decided to start small. She began by reaching out to her friends again. She talked about Frank, about the memories that had been flooding her mind, and slowly, piece by piece, she started to feel a sense of peace. It wasn't about moving on or forgetting. It was about learning to live with the pain, and still finding joy in the small moments. It was about accepting that the journey was still worth it, even without Frank by her side. And as Danielle began to find her way forward, she knew that no matter what, Frank's memory would always be with her. His laughter, his jokes, his friendship, they would stay with her forever. And that was something worth holding on to.